the girls. The girls.
Hi everyone. Well, I'm going to try to give you a quick update about what's going on in Egypt. And the question is still, is this going to bring about meaningful change or is it just a big charade? Egypt approves 15% raise for government employees. Well, I know that, the Egyptians are starving and they're poor and they're fed up and that they want Mubarak out of office because he's totally destroyed the country's economy. So what does the Mubarak government do? They give the government a raise. I don't see how that's going to help the problem. But what's interesting about this article is the way they talk about what's been going on over there. So they mentioned that Monday marked the 14th straight day of protests against Mubarak, and that the focal point still remains Tahrir Square in Cairo. And here's what they say. At the moment, observers say Tahrir Square has a camp-like atmosphere with food, street vendors, and entertainment inside its boundaries. At the edges of the square, protesters are lying down in front of army tanks to block them from entering the area. I think that's quite significant that they portray it this way, because the message seems to be, everything's okay. It's a camp-like atmosphere. We're all having fun here. It's kind of like back in the 60s with the peaceful sit-in protests. Got, entertainment and street vendors, so things must be simmering down, right? Of course, a few days ago, stolen embassy vans were mowing people down in the streets. So I guess they've come a long way from being mowed down by stolen embassy vans to sitting around having a happy protest with a camp-like atmosphere. Now, you may remember, as I've mentioned before in a couple of my vlogs, that according to an article on globalresearch.ca, Mubarak was the model IMF pupil. The hardships in Egypt largely had to do with the work of the IMF, in which Mubarak had participated. And he was also 83 years old, probably on his way out. U.S. foreign policy was in line with, him getting out of there. They didn't need him in there anymore. And that the protest groups had been funded and trained also by U.S. groups. So this basically pointed to the protests perhaps not being able to accomplish what they would like to, because in the end, the power structure above the power structure against which they're protesting remains entirely in place. And you may remember that on the 29th, Mubarak appoints new vice president prime minister. Hosni Mubarak appointed Omar Suleiman as his new vice president. So who is this Omar Suleiman? Well, according to Al Jazeera, Suleiman, the CIA's man in Cairo. Suleiman has long been favored by the U.S. government for his ardent anti-Islamism, his willingness to talk and act tough on Iran, and he has long been the CIA's main man in Cairo. So Suleiman has connections to the CIA. So surprise, surprise, Hillary Clinton signals U.S. backing for Omar Suleiman. Now the plan is apparently to have an orderly transition to the new government. Mubarak is going to resign and not rerun for election in September, neither is his son. And there needs to be this orderly transition. All these protests or these opposition groups are going to have to get together and work this out. But, what does this all really mean? They're going to have, a CIA point man, as he's called, taking the place of the president and creating order out of chaos? Look, I hate to say this, but as far as I can tell, this has been nothing but another charade. Not on the part of the Egyptians who are protesting, but on the part of, the media and the American government. Why does the U.S. get to decide who's going to be the next president of Egypt? I mean, Egypt doesn't have a say in who's going to be president of the U.S. So this stuff is just all, orchestrated by the globalists, and they did a really great job of making it look on the news like something really meaningful was going to come out of this, but in the end, it doesn't look like it will. The power structure will remain in place. The debts that these countries have to mostly the U.S., and then the solutions brought in by the IMF and the World Bank, these are at the root of the problems that they have today. It all comes down to, globalization and free trade and all these other things. So it doesn't really matter who you have in power. I mean, unless you untangle yourself from the IMF, unless you can get rid of your debt, unless you can get your national sovereignty back, nothing is going to change. So is there really any hope? Of course, the IMF is standing ready to offer advice to Egypt on how to sort things out after the impact that this has had on their economy. Maybe this is good news, Egypt not to seek IMF aid in crisis, says the minister. Well, the Egyptian financial minister Samir Radwan says the government is not going to seek any aid from the IMF to compensate losses due to massive protests that swept Egypt for the past 2 weeks. Okay, great. They're not going to seek aid from the IMF to help with what happened due to the protests, but that doesn't mean they're not going to be totally tangled up with the IMF anyway. The IMF is standing there ready to give them more help, and it's so ironic. They're the ones who got them in the situation in the first place, and now they want to help them get out of this situation. So the IMF is there ready to offer their kind advice to Egypt, and Egypt at least has a sense to say, no thanks, we don't need your financial help to straighten out the mess that was caused during these couple of weeks of protests. But I'd be willing to bet that they're going to take their advice, in the bigger picture, unfortunately. And meanwhile, they've got the CIA guy ready to step up and fill in, do the job, a guy backed by the US. And our media around here is kind of giving the message that, well, show's over, everything's okay now, go home. So I get the picture that, the show is over, the charade is over, and they have just effected basically a regime change and given the impression that it was accomplished through, the Egyptians' own protests. But I think that all along this is like something playing out on a chessboard. But let's not lose hope. Maybe things will change. Well, thanks for listening to me, and I'll see you next time.